Hello and welcome to our fifth CAHRS webcast of 2019. My name is Brad Bell. I'm a faculty member here in the HR Studies program at Cornell. John is also a faculty member in the HR Studies program, and he serves as the Director of ILR Executive Education. Today we're going to be talking about HR analytics. This is a topic that John has been doing a lot of work on over the last several years. He's run a number of different CAHRS working groups on this topic. He recently ran one hosted by Estee Lauder in New York City, but has probably done half a dozen, something like that, over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So really thought this would be a good opportunity to sit down with John and kind of think through, what are some of the current trends, but also where have you seen kind of the field of analytics evolving over the last several years. So to give you a little bit of insight into kind of how we're going to structure the next 30 minutes or so, we'll start out by, I'll ask John a few questions to react to around this topic and kind of what he's seeing in the field. We'll then reserve at least the last 10 minutes, maybe more, to take any questions that you have. So please go ahead and submit your questions at any time. We might take some of them as we go along, but certainly we'll reserve a chunk of time at the end to delve into those. So John, thanks for being with us today.
Sure, glad to be here.
So, we've been hearing a lot of buzz about analytics, AI, algorithms, and, similar concepts. So, based on what you've seen, how far have companies really progressed in these different areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think although we hear a lot of buzz about these topics, it's a very small proportion of companies that are actually going to those latest cutting edge kind of tools and techniques. So for the most part, what I'm hearing is a lot of organizations are still grappling with the basics of how to get going and moving in metrics and analytics. So in the working groups that I've been involved with, we hear a good number of companies that are doing interesting projects with analytics, and they might be partnering with outside companies on tools or techniques that involve AI or algorithms, but for the most part, I think your core workforce analytics groups, for the ones that I'm familiar with, have been really wrestling with how do we get good, clean data, how do we get the right metrics together and out to end users, and then if we have the time, how do we think about those impactful projects that involve analytics. So although there's a lot of buzz on those terms, I think for the most part, the majority of companies are really just trying to move from metrics to analytics still.
So, one of the things I think we've heard a lot about, at least in recent years, is companies really trying to shift from just, kind of data and reporting to really being able to draw more insights out of analytics to drive decision making. So maybe that's part of kind of where companies are striving to go. But what have you seen in terms of that evolution?
Yeah, for sure. I think, historically, I'd say maybe 5-7 years ago, what we would see is companies just thinking kind of data as the overall umbrella, and how do we build an analytics group that can do everything, reporting, analytics, whatever it might be. I think what we're seeing today is more realization that these are two very different processes that you're trying to build, the metrics and reporting arm as well as the kind of analytics and insights piece. They involve different data sources, they involve different processes for how you go about building the systems and the data sets. They involve different skill sets, right? The people who are good at retrieving and querying databases are not the same people that are good at hypothesizing relationships and building statistical models. So the evolution that I've seen is a little bit of splitting of the reporting and analytics, sometimes literally in terms of structure, where there are different groups and maybe one sits under the other or they have a connection. Other cases, not at all. They're really like literally different groups. So I think what we're seeing today is a little bit more of a realization that there's not just an umbrella metrics analytics group that can be asked to kind of go back and forth between those two.
Yeah. So on this topic of structure, have you seen kind of an ideal structure, or are there certain things that influence kind of what type of structure seems to work best in different companies or different contexts?
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas that's still emerging. It's starting to me to feel like the general question of what's the right structure for an organization, which is there is no right structure. It depends on kind of what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve. So I've seen all sorts of structures, the highly centralized workforce analytics group that's maybe 5, 7, 10, 20 or more people. I've seen the highly decentralized setup where it's maybe one or two at the center, but really you're asking people either located in business units or HR in general to just raise their level of skill in using data. Each has their pros and cons, right? The centralized tool kind of as a clearinghouse for different projects and opportunities to work with data and analytics enterprise-wide, and they can prioritize issues. So that's a nice feature of that model, but then you sort of lose touch with what's happening locally. And then the reverse, in the more decentralized model, it's sort of free, everyone's free to do what they wish with the data, and you run into issues of kind of duplication of effort or lack of agreement on data sources. And so that has its own drawbacks, but at least people then can answer their specific question within the business that they're serving. So it's an area that's still evolving, but that's what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. And so just in terms of sheer size of these units or teams, particularly in maybe the more centralized version, I mean, are we seeing more kind of investment in kind of analytics professionals within the HR space?
Yeah, I think overall, especially in the companies that we're talking with, we are seeing in the large organizations, I'd say historically, more investment in workforce analytics. And that can be in terms of just sheer number of headcount within that space. So maybe if it were 5 years ago, 2 people in a 100,000 person company, maybe today it's 5 or 7, right? Because they've had an increased demand for the kinds of things that those groups can do. So I think on the whole, you are seeing greater investment. And it's not just in the people, but also the systems and tools to help support the groups. So on the whole, these teams tend to be still pretty small, right? We hear a lot in the working groups about teams of 2, 4, 5, 7 at the center. In other cases, you have the very large organizations with a heavy demand for analytics. They might be in the double digits easily and have kind of subgroups that work on metrics, reporting versus analytics, and other workforce planning or some other pocket here. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, if I were to compare, back to some of the first ones that we did, you're definitely seeing an increase in the investment in this space.
And to what extent are these groups tapping into, because a lot of organizations have analytics or at least data capabilities that are relatively advanced and robust in other parts of the company. To what extent are we seeing HR kind of partner or pull those resources in or somehow leverage those resources?
Yeah, I think where I'm seeing that is sort of in organizations where they're trying to get started and get some momentum, maybe smaller organizations or ones where there's not as much of a culture that supports this. Instead of going out and hiring, 5 data scientists and some PhDs to begin your workforce analytics group, what they're doing is saying, we know we have good people data, we know we have questions we'd like to address, can we pull together resources from different parts of the organization? So, it's something we talk about in the working groups, or I talk about in class, is that HR analytics really is a multidisciplinary sort of area if you're going to do it well, right? There's very few people that know the methodology part, that know the strategy and business well, that know the data and systems and tools, that can present, that can consult. And so, that's the area I think where for organizations that are just getting started, they're picking up those skills, not necessarily from HR, and pulling together the resources that way.
Yeah, great. So, as we think about the companies that are maybe trying to kind of advance in this area or move forward in this area, what are maybe some of the challenges that they're likely to face, the pitfalls they're likely to encounter? I mean, what should they be watching out for?
Yeah, so the challenges I'd say are consistent year to year. Some haven't gone away. I've seen progress in some areas, but data systems and the ability of those systems to talk to one another and for end users to be able to pull the data they need, still a very common challenge. A lot of the data governance piece of this is still pretty weak in a lot of cases where people disagree on how to define something, or they have it sitting in different systems with different definitions, and you go to try to pull reports together, and it's very challenging. So I think data quality, data access, data accuracy is a theme that comes up again and again, and it was there at the start. On the flip side, some things that were discussed as kind of pain points early on are now we're seeing a lot more progress in it. One would be just having data on your people, right? I'd say 10 years ago it was sort of the basics. You could look at historical information on employees. You might have some supplementary data from other systems. Now it's almost like a proliferation of data where organizations and workforce analytics groups are saying, okay, we've got all this, what do we do with it? And so it's a different problem than we saw before. We have a lot of data, and now where do we make the most of it? So I think that's another area where we've seen some changes in development over time.
And how have you seen maybe companies sort through that issue, right? We have all this data that's out there. How do we start to sift through it or make some choices about what we're going to really focus on or measure? Have you seen companies kind of wrestle with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a lot of discipline to make sense of that kind of situation. So if it's a centralized workforce analytics team with very specific business challenges, they can start to hone in on what the problem or opportunity is, think about their available data, maybe even collect new data sources. So when it's an analytics type of project, I think you get more opportunity to be purposeful in how you're sifting through the different data sources you have. The flip side on the more ad hoc reporting and just trying to make sense of what you have, I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes up, because you have so much information. Some of it's duplicative, some of it's irrelevant, right? And for the average end user or HR professional, I think it's challenging really to make sense of what's useful, what's not useful amongst all the data that we're collecting.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions coming in, so maybe we can dive into those. So you talked about how companies, 5 years ago might have had these, smaller teams, relative to their employee populations. That's increasing. How do you think it will evolve? I mean, will we see these teams continue to grow? Will they change in composition? I mean, what do you think the trend looks like there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at sort of an inflection point, if you will, in the development of workforce analytics, in the sense that there's a lot of buzz, a lot of hype, especially in the last 5-7 years or so, for this topic. And so companies just invested and said, well, we should be doing this. It's happened in other areas within the business. It's coming to HR. Let's make the investment. And then I think there was the realization that it's not so easy to do this and to do it well. And so, teams that have invested and continue to grow, I think, went through a period of figuring out what they really needed and what would best support their kind of business goals and so forth. So there's a little bit of correction, I think, in some of this. Like, if we're going to make a huge investment, what do we get for that big investment? And then maybe we don't need that large of a team, or we can accomplish this in different ways. So I think it will continue to evolve. I'm not sure how large it will grow, but that said, we've seen some companies that in the last 5 years went from 3 to 25 people in this group, because they're so large, and they realized, once the business realized that this group can actually do some pretty interesting and impactful stuff, they kept adding resources to the team. So hard to say that it will really slow down, actually, if there's a lot of value being delivered.
Yeah. I mean, when you've seen those cases where there's really been this growth, is that being driven through kind of HR realizing that this is a value driver for them, the business asking for more of it, or is it, kind of a both?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a combination of the two. Once business leaders and their HR folks realize that they can actually make better decisions with good data, then it's kind of a reinforcing cycle. Like any new issue that comes up, then they say, well, let's go to my contact in the analytics team and help get some input into this. So in my experience with this, it seems like it's a much better scenario when you're getting pulled into different projects. It can be overwhelming, and then you got to prioritize and all that, triage what's coming in, than to be sort of a big team and pushing out different things and kind of hoping they stick. So I think that's what's driven the growth in those companies, is the heavy pull of the business.
Makes sense. So another question that came in, is there any company or industry that you see as kind of the standard bearer for HR analytics?
Yeah, it's a very common question. I think there's a lot of companies that are very large that have made good investments in workforce analytics. I don't know enough to kind of get in there or get behind, beneath the hood, whatever it is, and see exactly what they're doing and comment on the quality of it. But if you think of some very large organizations in the Fortune 500, a lot of them have made the investment, and they're doing some really interesting things, right? Some publicize it more so than others, so you hear about the Googles and IBMs of the world doing really cool and interesting things. But there are lots of other companies that we talk to that you might not expect, but that are also in that same boat. So hard to say on the company side kind of who's leading the charge, because a lot are, and there's so many companies, I don't know who's actually in the lead there. But in terms of industries, the one thing I would say is that if the sector is already known for being data-driven or for having lots of access to good, clean data, much more likely to make the investment in workforce analytics and try to make those connections to their business data. Some of your more hierarchical, old school companies led more by expert opinion, very slow to adopt analytics. So it's not so much industry as much maybe as it is kind of culture and some of the other aspects of the company.
Yeah.
Great question.
So this question is about kind of the data we should be looking at. What data do you suggest should be collected in people analytics models and how to collect them? Obviously, that's going to depend on the questions we want to ask, but are there some standards that we probably want to make sure that we have?
Yeah, I mean, something I talk about quite a bit in classes that I teach is this kind of 2x2 idea of new and existing data sort of on one axis, and then so if you think about, okay, we have internal and external data as well, so that's the other axis. But so if you just think about the combination there, what a lot of companies go to is the existing internal data, that cell of the quadrant, if you will, and sort of try to really make the most of that data, which is great. But oftentimes, to your point, the question or the issue that you're trying to solve for requires data from the other quadrants, and it's going to take some effort to pull in maybe external data to account for the fact that maybe your units work in or operate in different local labor market environments. So you need unemployment data from BLS or something. So external data, and then new data collection, not just existing data, but thinking, okay, we have this issue, it's really important. We want to know how to improve the quality of hire. Let's interview some folks or do a survey. We haven't done it before, so. To me, it's around starting with the question and then thinking about the data sources you have, and if they're not appropriate, then thinking beyond that. But the other point I'd say is that we're seeing a lot more with unstructured data, so we always think of kind of your rows and columns structured data sets, and that's of course very helpful, but with so much information available now through either social media or internal email or networks or what have you, not that it's always kind of giving you some magical insight, but it's yet another data source that companies are, I think, starting to take a look at that's beyond your traditional rows and columns.
Yeah, makes sense. This question is a little bit along the same lines, but it says, we keep saying workforce analytics. What are these companies really tracking? I mean, and again, a lot of variability, I'm sure, but do you see like any company that's advanced to a certain point in analytics is probably at least looking at X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge with terminology in this area is that we don't have kind of common agreement on what metrics, analytics, and these other terms, people insights. There's lots of terms thrown around for this. And so you might have an analytics group and they're not actually doing analytics, they're doing a lot of reporting, right? So if we're talking purely about analytics, sort of looking at bringing different data sources together, running statistical models and so forth, I think the most common is still attrition, right? Flight risk kinds of analyses to try to get a handle on who's likely to leave and when. You still see a lot with engagement data, a lot with workforce planning, trying to get ahead of who's going to be where in 1 year, couple of years, right, and plan if at all possible for those scenarios given historical data. I think a lot of companies are looking at things like internal mobility, how people move up through and out of the organization, and segmenting that by different employee groups or populations. So it's kind of some common themes in terms of where analytics is being applied, and that would be at the high level. I think beneath that it's these ad hoc projects that have a very important business application or use that might not be your run-of-the-mill attrition modeling, but that are very important. So you're trying to forecast retirements and understand, kind of what you need to do to plan for that, or you're having trouble recruiting this one geographic area. So it's kind of this, very focused study to try to understand what's happening in that domain. So you have some commonalities, but then some, more specific projects I think that are coming up.
So I think you just kind of addressed this a little bit, but a couple people are asking about, some examples, particularly kind of cool or interesting things that you've seen, particularly around the more predictive space. So you just talked about flight risk, that's obviously a predictive example.
Yeah.
Other cases that you've seen where, that seems like a really interesting application of HR analytics.
Yeah. So I'll just share two that I'm familiar with more from reading the popular press, and that's Xerox and JetBlue and some of the things that they're doing around predicting, either in the case of Xerox, attrition, and in the case of JetBlue, actually trying to predict flight attendant absenteeism or attendance patterns. And it's all through the selection process in both cases, right? So looking for assessments or new ways of thinking about the selection process, collecting data to identify not just what leads someone to perform well, because that's sort of what we've always done, but perform well plus stay, in the case of Xerox in the call center environment. Perform well and show up for work in the case of JetBlue, right? And both are extremely costly. In the case of Xerox, it costs quite a bit to continuously replace, and then in the JetBlue environment, flight attendants don't show up for work. You've got all sorts of problems with, shuffling staffing around, and then flight delays, dissatisfied customers, and so on. And so maybe the applications aren't so new in the sense that we've always long thought about how to best predict performance and so forth, but it is a predictive application. It is trying to be thoughtful about something new and different about what kind of employees you might want in those environments, and then using the data to test it and improve upon those practices. So, those would be a couple of examples in the more predictive sense of we have data at time A, and we're trying to understand what's likely to happen at time B.
Mm-hmm. How about so there's a question around tools, right? So what types of tools, systems are companies using to either gather the data and or to assist with the analysis part of this?
Yeah, so I'll start with the analysis, and it's surprising to some people, but Microsoft Excel is the tool. It's available pretty freely. It's accessible. It doesn't cost a lot. People already kind of know how to use it. It has a good amount of functionality, right, for some basic analysis and for some visualizations that get the job done, right? And then you move beyond that and you start to think about more advanced tools if needed. And so you get into like the Tableaus and Power BIs and other ways to visualize information that's maybe more efficient or simply looks better, right? And in terms of data analysis, there's a whole suite of statistical software tools that are out there, everything from SPSS to SAS and Stata and R and Minitab and so forth. And that's going to give you the efficiency on the analysis side, right? So rather than a whole host of formulas built into Excel kind of awkwardly on the side, you can do some analyses much more efficiently on larger data sets. So I think it's still kind of that big suite of tools. Your workforce analytics teams often have access to all of that, or most of it as needed. Your average person kind of running through some descriptive data on a metrics or reporting side, it's often Excel still.
Mm-hmm. And on the data collection side, we're using the Workdays and the other kind of, HRIS systems essentially are feeding the data.
Yeah, absolutely still that. Your ATS, your LMS, your engagement survey data, and then any number of other supplementary sources that might have useful information that you could analyze for a specific question. So like I mentioned earlier, the email traffic. And I think companies are starting to experiment with other what would be called more like passive data collection sources. So I don't have a good example on this one, but you think of like badge swipes, and that's telling you something about your workforce, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know what the use case is right now, but it could be something that you'd analyze for patterns of productivity or connect it to some outcome, right? Mm-hmm. But I think we are starting to see the HR and kind of organizational space opening up to data collection methods that aren't our traditional survey or existing system.
Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting question around, what do you see as the pros and cons of kind of who we bring into these analytics roles, right? The pros and cons of hiring a data scientist that may really have no knowledge of the human capital or HR space versus hiring maybe someone from marketing or kind of taking an HR person and trying to upskill them, kind of add on the analytics kind of competency on top of their HR knowledge.
Yeah, I wish I had the magic solution here, but I think it's a good point because the skills that are required to do this well at an organizational capability level are, complex. There are many, and so trying to build a team that best satisfies your needs is really challenging. I think what we quickly realized is that bringing in a team of 5 data scientists is not the answer. To your point, They don't understand the business. They may not be able to translate this into terms that people understand. Very rigorous in terms of the modeling and data management and all of that kind of stuff. So I think companies are experimenting still with what the right mix is on the team. But to me, it seems like you've got to have those core elements of the business knowledge, the consulting skills to understand and translate those problems to testable analytics projects. You've got to have someone who understands the workforce and HR and some of the implications of decisions that might be made in this context. Obviously, you need the IT kind of data side to be addressed in all of this. How do you get systems to talk to one another and pull the right information or build systems, govern the data? And I think there's another piece that's sort of interesting is some companies have added someone with more of a visual design or graphic design background to kind of bring some of this information and insights to life, because we know your average data scientist, good with data and good with modeling, but can they translate it to an audience that's non-technical and help explain kind of what the patterns are and what it means and what we're going to do differently? So put all those skills together, and it's, how do you almost build the blueprint of how you're going to check those boxes off and what different skills you'll need. Yeah. And obviously some companies are going to need to gravitate more towards one side or the other.
So this question is about kind of how this applies to HRBPs. So you have a workforce analytics kind of decision-making process. Some of that might sit in the COEs or other parts, but specifically for the HRBPs, any best practices or recommendations on how companies should be positioning them to leverage analytics?
Yeah, I think going back again early on, it was around how do we almost convert them to be users of data and analysts themselves. I think what we're seeing is backing off from that to say, look, they've got enough on their plates already, but yet at the same time, some of the decisions could be informed by good data analysis. So what I'm seeing is more of an investment in the consumer, basically being a good consumer of data, helping frame questions for your workforce analytics group, being sort of the broker between maybe what the business needs and what the analytics group can do. And so I think for them, we're not seeing as much, you've got to elevate your analytical, statistical skills and run these models as much as it is when these things are being built, kind of checking the sensibility of the models and the approaches, helping with data collection, right? Improving systems so that we're getting good data on the front end, so that when we go to analyze it later, we have good information to take a look at. So that's sort of what I'm seeing in terms of that population.
So this question is about kind of what they are arguing is or suggesting is often maybe HR analytics kind of gets siloed just in the kind of looking only at human capital issues. Have you seen examples where HR analytics have been combined with maybe marketing data or production data or other sources of data that may exist within the business to kind of look at more holistic solutions or patterns that might exist?
Yeah, I think it's one of those that depends again so much on the industry, the setting, and so forth. And I'm actually thinking of my own research. I tend to gravitate towards these settings where the business data and the human capital or people data can be easily aligned. So if you think about retail stores, for example, for the most part, what we consider very clean operational performance metrics, and you can sort of control for a lot of things on that side. And then you have a lot of people data on who's there, maybe some engagement data, manager quality, and so forth. Very clean sort of natural data structure that lends to good analytics projects. Contrast that with your average professional services kind of setting where it's not really clear what the outcome is and how we would connect it to some business metric for a team that's thinking about new product development. And so I think the settings almost dictates how easy it is to make that connection. And when it's not so clean, I don't think we should continue to struggle to say, how do we do it? How do we connect to business outcomes? It's probably not possible because organizational performance sits up here and we have got people data down here. We're not going to be able to make that link cleanly. And then there are other settings where it's possible, and it just takes some effort to kind of make the linkage analytically.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think we have time maybe for one more question, kind of a broader one, but where do you see the field going over the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, if you look in your crystal ball, where do you think we're heading?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. I think the field's at a bit of a crossroads in the sense of what value will be delivered by workforce analytics going forward. And I think we're seeing the value in a lot of cases, but overall, kind of, is this something we should continue to build and develop, and what is the potential, right? I think the potential was seen as unlimited early on. Now we realize all the challenges in doing it with people data. So what's the real value? I think that remains to be seen. Can't go without mentioning all the privacy, ethical, regulatory issues that are coming up in this, especially as we think about new tools that help us collect data from employees that might be seen as invasive. So some of the electronic monitoring or other technologies that are emerging or already out there. I think that's another issue that's yet to be resolved, especially for those global organizations that are wrestling with heavy variation in how these things are received in their local environments. So you've got that piece. I think you're also going to see a little bit of maybe it's consolidation or some sort of commoditization of some pieces of this process, right? We're already seeing it a little bit with these startups that are trying to use AI and algorithms to help just sort of automate some of the things that we would put a person in charge of, right? Compare this spreadsheet with this one and look for any discrepancies and whatever it might be. Some of that work is being automated, and the data, I think, is helping feed some of that, some of those processes. So that'll evolve, but I don't see much changing in terms of the need for good critical thinking skills to identify the problems, to choose the right data sources, to do the work itself, understand what it means, and make decisions about what becomes of it as a result. So I don't see the systems and tools rising to replace the human judgment anytime soon.
Well, it'll be interesting where things head, for sure.